The diplomatic chamber aboard the neutral station Harmony's Edge hummed with the barely contained tension of first contact protocol. Commander Vexai adjusted his ceremonial armor plates, the bioluminescent patterns along his carapace shifting to display formal greeting configurations. Around him, representatives from 7 different species maintained their respective atmospheric bubbles and gravity fields, each one a testament to the delicate balance required for interspecies cooperation. The humans were late. Typical primitive behavior, chittered Ambassador Sisktal through her translation matrix, her insectoid features twitching with disdain, probably still trying to figure out how to operate the docking procedures. Vex Hayes' 4 eyes focused on the main display showing the human vessel's approach. The ship was peculiar. Where most civilized craft followed the elegant curves and energy-efficient designs perfected over millions of years of space travel, the human vessel appeared to have been assembled from geometric blocks welded together by someone with only a basic understanding of physics. It bristled with what looked like primitive projectile weapons and chemical thrusters that leaked visible exhaust. Energy signatures are all wrong, reported science coordinator Thymel from her aquatic suspension. Their power source appears to be controlled nuclear reactions. Controlled nuclear reactions! How they haven't blown themselves to atoms is beyond comprehension. The docking clamps engaged with a series of metallic clangs that resonated through the station's hull. Proper docking procedures involved synchronized gravity fields and harmonic frequency matching. The humans had simply attached themselves with mechanical force. Atmospheric analysis complete, announced the station's AI in its perfectly modulated tones. The human delegation requires a standard oxygen-nitrogen mixture at 1 standard atmospheric pressure. Temperature range optimal at 290 to 5 Kelvin. Remarkably simple requirements. The airlock cycled, and the first human stepped into the chamber. Vexai he'd studied the preliminary biological reports, but seeing one in person was still jarring. The creature was impossibly tall and thin, its body supported by only 2 legs connected to a torso that seemed too narrow for proper organ distribution. The head, perched on top, contained the most unsettling feature, 2 forward-facing eyes that suggested a predatory heritage, though the species claimed to be omnivorous. This particular human wore what appeared to be a simple blue and white uniform with minimal armor plating. No visible weapons, no energy shields, no environmental suit beyond a thin layer of fabric. The creature was effectively naked by civilized standards. "Greetings," the human said, its mouth opening to reveal flat white grinding teeth interrupted by pointed canines. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth Alliance. Thank you for hosting this meeting." The translation was perfect, but something in the human's vocal patterns set Vexay's combat instincts on edge. There was no subservience in the tone, no deference to clearly superior civilizations. The human spoke as an equal. Ambassador Sistal's translator crackled to life. "We welcome you to civilized space, human Chen. Though your species shows promise, you must understand that integration into the Galactic Confederation requires adherence to established protocols and recognition of the natural hierarchy of civilized beings." The human's face arranged itself into an expression Vexai would later learn was called a smile. It was not reassuring. "I appreciate the welcome, Ambassador. We're excited to learn about galactic civilization, though I should mention, we prefer to evaluate hierarchies based on actions rather than assumptions." A moment of silence followed this statement. In the diplomatic language of the Confederation, the human had just politely indicated they would not be subordinating themselves to anyone till given a reason to do so. "Perhaps," Vexai interjected, his translator rendering his clicking mandible speech into standard galactic, "we should begin with basic information exchange. Our preliminary scans of your home system suggest your species developed space travel remarkably quickly after achieving technological civilization. How did you overcome the natural barriers to interstellar flight?" Captain Chen's smile widened slightly. "We didn't overcome them so much as ignore them until we found workarounds. Our first attempts at faster-than-light travel killed more test pilots than most species lose in entire wars, but eventually we figured out how to fold space without folding the people inside the ships." The casual mention of massive casualties delivered with the same tone one might use to discuss weather patterns caused a ripple of unease through the assembled delegates. Species typically spent centuries or millennia perfecting safe space travel technologies. The humans had apparently thrown their people at the problem until it was solved through sheer attrition. "Surely your governing bodies implemented safety protocols," pressed science coordinator Thymel, her aquatic form undulating with agitation. "The loss of trained personnel would set back any civilization's development by decades." "Oh, we had safety protocols," Chen replied cheerfully. "We just also had volunteers who were willing to ignore them. Turns out when you tell humans something is impossible or too dangerous, about 10% of us immediately want to prove you wrong. We call them test pilots, explorers, and engineers. Vex-High felt his combat-rated nervous system register something it had never encountered before. A species that treated death as an acceptable cost of curiosity. In his experience, self-preservation was the foundational instinct upon which all civilization was built. Remove that, and what remained? Captain Chen, he said carefully, during your species' development, what was the primary driving force behind your rapid technological advancement? Most civilizations are motivated by resource acquisition, territorial expansion, or defense against natural disasters. The human's eyes focused on him directly, and Vex-High experienced another unfamiliar sensation. Those forward-facing predator eyes held intelligence, but also something else. Something that made his evolutionary prey recognition systems whisper warnings. All of those played a part, Chen admitted. But honestly, we kept going because it was interesting. Every question we answered led to 10 more questions. Every problem we solved revealed 10 more problems. We couldn't stop because we could never see all the way to the end of what was possible. Even when the cost was the lives of your own species, asked Ambassador Sisktal, her translator unable to completely mask the horror in her voice. Chen's expression shifted, becoming more serious but losing none of its intensity. Ambassador, every human who volunteered for our early space program knew the risks. They didn't do it because they didn't value their lives. They did it because they valued the future more than they feared death. We have a saying, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. The delegation chamber fell silent as translation matrices processed not just the words, but the philosophical implications. Here was a species that had weaponized curiosity, turned self-sacrifice into a cultural virtue, and treated impossible odds as interesting challenges rather than insurmountable barriers. Vex-High's tactical mind began running probability assessments. If humans were willing to die for knowledge, what would they do when protecting something they actually cared about? If they treated their own lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of advancement, how would they value the lives of allies? Or enemies? Your species' approach to problem-solving is unique, he said diplomatically. Perhaps you could provide examples of how human methods might complement existing Confederation technologies and strategies. Captain Chen's smile returned, and this time Vex-High noticed something he had missed before. The expression reached the human's eyes, but those eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no civilized being should possess. This was not the face of a primitive newcomer seeking approval from advanced civilizations. This was the face of someone who had seen the impossible become routine, and was politely offering to share the experience. Absolutely, Commander, Chen said, somehow knowing his rank despite no formal introductions. We've brought some documentation of our recent projects. Fair warning, though. Our methods tend to be a bit more direct than what you might be used to. The human reached into a simple fabric pouch at her waist and withdrew a data storage device that appeared to be nothing more than a small crystalline cube. She placed it on the central display table, where it interfaced automatically with the station's systems. Information began streaming across the holographic displays, and Vex-High felt his understanding of the universe shift in fundamental ways. The humans hadn't just achieved interstellar flight. They had done it wrong, in ways that violated basic principles of physics, using methods that should have been impossible, and somehow made it work through sheer stubborn refusal to accept failure. Their faster-than-light drive folded space by creating controlled quantum singularities and surfing the resulting gravitational waves. The power requirements alone should have been beyond any civilization that hadn't mastered stellar engineering. The humans generated that power by feeding matter directly into pocket dimensions they had learned to create and control. They had achieved in 50 years what most species took 50,000 years to accomplish, and they had done it by treating cosmic forces like engineering problems that simply required sufficient application of violence and creativity. "This is impossible," whispered Science Coordinator Thymal, her aquatic form rippling with shock. "The energy expenditure alone would bankrupt the resources of a dozen systems." "That's what we thought too," Chen agreed amiably. "Turns out when you stop trying to work within physical limitations and start figuring out how to renegotiate them, the universe is surprisingly flexible." Ambassador Sisktal's translator crackled with static as her emotional state overwhelmed the device. "You cannot simply ignore physics. There are rules, natural laws, that govern reality itself." The human's expression became almost gentle, like an adult explaining something to a confused child. "Ambassador, With respect, natural laws are just descriptions of how things usually work. They're not cosmic commandments. When we needed to exceed light speed, we didn't break physics. We just found a loophole. Vexai's combat computer was running continuous threat assessments, and every single calculation was returning the same result. Unknown. His species had conquered 3 star systems through superior tactics, advanced technology, and careful risk assessment. They understood warfare, diplomacy, and the mathematics of survival. They had no framework for understanding a species that treated the impossible as a starting point for negotiations. The data continued streaming, showing human achievements that read like fiction. They had tamed black holes, negotiated with quantum uncertainty, and convinced entire star systems to relocate because the views were better elsewhere. Each accomplishment was documented with the casual precision of a maintenance report. But it was the final entry that made Vexai's ichor run cold. Project Lazarus, Captain Chen said as new data appeared. Our most recent success. We've learned how to reverse entropy on a local scale. Death, as it turns out, is more of a suggestion than a requirement. The implications hit him like a kinetic strike. A species that had conquered death would have no concept of ultimate stakes. Every negotiation, every conflict, every desperate last stand would be meaningless to beings who could simply undo the consequences later. You've achieved technological immortality? He asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos in his thoughts. Oh no, Chen replied, and her smile took on an edge that made Vexai's predator recognition system scream warnings. We've achieved actual immortality. Technology just handles the paperwork. The diplomatic chamber had fallen completely silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems. 7 species that had considered themselves the pinnacle of galactic civilization were staring at a representative of a species that had apparently solved the fundamental equation of existence itself. Why, whispered Ambassador Siskdal, why share this with us? With your capabilities, you could dominate the entire galaxy. Captain Chen looked genuinely surprised by the question. Why would we want to dominate you? Domination is boring. We're much more interested in seeing what happens when everyone gets to play with the same toys. The human paused, then added with the same casual tone she might use to mention the weather. Besides, the universe is vast and full of interesting problems. We figure more minds working on them means we'll solve them faster. And who knows, maybe you'll teach us something we haven't thought of yet. Vexai felt something crack in his worldview. Here was a species with godlike power offering to share it freely. Not for profit or political advantage, but out of curiosity about what might happen next. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Vexai of the Third Hegemony experienced genuine fear. Not fear of death, which was familiar and manageable, not fear of defeat, which was at least comprehensible. He was afraid of a species that had transcended every limitation that defined civilized behavior and still chose to act with benevolent curiosity. As Captain Chen continued explaining human achievements with the enthusiasm of a child sharing favorite toys, Vexai realized that everything the Confederation thought it knew about power, survival, and the natural order of the universe was about to change. And the humans thought it would be fun. 3 months after first contact, the crisis began. The Void Eaters had returned. Commander Vexai stood in the war room aboard the Confederation flagship Eternal Vigilance, watching tactical displays that showed the impossible becoming horribly real. Across 7 sectors of space, reality itself was being consumed by entities that existed outside the normal boundaries of physics. Estimation of hostile fleet strength? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be meaningless. Unknown, sir, replied Tactical Coordinator Brixisnell, his crystalline form flickering with stress patterns. The Void Eaters don't register on conventional sensors. We're tracking them by the absence they leave behind. Stars, planets, entire solar systems. Simply stop existing. Vexai's forehands moved across the control interface, calling up historical records from the last Void Eater incursion 3,000 years ago. The Confederation had survived that encounter, barely, by sacrificing 12 entire species to buy time for the remaining civilizations to develop quantum shielding technology. Even with that protection, they had lost 40% of known space before the entities retreated to whatever dimension they called home. Current shield effectiveness? He asked, though he suspected the answer would not be encouraging. 18% below optimal, reported Defense Coordinator Yithral from her atmospheric cloud. The quantum resonance patterns have shifted since their last incursion. Our shields are holding, but they're being adapted to in real time. The tactical display updated to show the latest readings from the front lines. 3 Confederation battle groups had engaged the Void Eaters near the Kepler Consortium's industrial worlds. 2 of those battle groups no longer existed. The third was retreating at maximum speed, broadcasting warnings that their quantum weapons had no effect whatsoever. "Sir," Communications Officer Drollahai announced, his voice carrying the harmonics of barely controlled panic. "Incoming transmission from the human task force. They're requesting permission to engage the hostiles." Vex High's mandibles clicked involuntarily. The human task force consisted of exactly 12 ships, each one a geometric impossibility that appeared to have been designed by engineers who had never heard of aerodynamics, structural integrity, or basic physics. Compared to the massive Confederation fleet with its tens of thousands of vessels, the human contingent was barely worth acknowledging. "Inform Captain Chen that we appreciate the offer, but recommend they maintain position with the civilian evacuation fleet," he replied. "These entities are beyond conventional military responses." The reply came back almost instantly. Captain Chen respectfully acknowledges the recommendation and formally requests permission to engage the hostiles. She says, and I quote, "We've been looking forward to meeting these things for months." An uncomfortable silence settled over the war room. The phrase "looking forward to" was not typically associated with encountering entities that could erase matter from existence through means that defied understanding. "Sir," Tactical Coordinator Brixnell announced, "the Void Eaters have reached the Proxima defense grid. The automated systems are engaging." The holographic display lit up with the familiar patterns of defensive combat. Thousands of automated weapons platforms opened fire simultaneously, creating a barrier of energy that should have been sufficient to halt any conventional fleet. Quantum torpedoes, gravity mines, and reality anchors deployed in precisely calculated patterns designed to create an impenetrable wall of destruction. The Void Eaters passed through it as if it didn't exist. "Defensive grid failure," reported Brixnell, his crystalline form now pulsing with alarm colors. "All automated systems have been consumed. Proxima Station is requesting immediate evacuation assistance." Vexai felt the familiar ice of combat fear crystallizing in his circulatory system. This was the fear he understood, the fear that sharpened reflexes and focused thoughts, the fear of a warrior facing overwhelming odds. "All available ships to Proxima Station," he ordered. "Begin emergency evacuation procedures. Civilian transports get priority launch clearance." "Sir," interrupted Communications Officer Drollhai, "Captain Chen is broadcasting on all frequencies. She's requesting that all Confederation forces clear the engagement zone." "Clear the engagement zone?" Vexhai repeated, his translator struggling with the concept. "There are 17 million civilians on Proxima Station. Clear it for what?" "She says they're going to try something new," Drollhai replied, his voice carrying harmonics of confusion. Her exact words were, "This looks like fun, but we need some room to work." Before Vexhai could respond, the human task force accelerated toward the Void Eaters at speeds that should have liquefied any organic crew. Their ships moved in formation patterns that violated every principle of space combat tactics, clustering together when they should spread out, accelerating when they should decelerate, and heading directly toward an enemy that had just erased an entire defensive grid. "What are they doing?" whispered Defense Coordinator Yithrel, her atmospheric form rippling with disbelief. Vexay activated his personal communication array, opening a direct channel to the human flagship. "Captain Chen, please explain your tactical approach. We register no weapon signatures from your vessels." The response came back with the sound of human laughter in the background. "That's because we're not using weapons, Commander. We're using physics." On the tactical display, the 12 human ships had reached the edge of the Void Eater formation. What happened next challenged every assumption about space combat that Vexhai had accumulated over his long career. The human ships didn't fire at the entities. Instead, they began moving in precise geometric patterns around them, their trajectories forming complex three-dimensional shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the display could properly render. "Energy readings are off the scale," reported Science Coordinator Thymel, her aquatic form churning with excitement despite the circumstances. "The humans are generating localized gravitational fields that shouldn't be possible with ships that size." "What kind of gravitational fields?" Vexhai asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would be incomprehensible. "They're creating recursive loops in space-time," Thymel replied, her voice filled with awe. "Each ship is generating a pocket dimension that folds back on itself. The cumulative effect is, Commander, they're turning the Void Eaters inside out." The tactical display shifted to show energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. The human ships were weaving reality into knots, creating spatial conditions that existed only in theoretical mathematics. Where their formation passed, the Void Eaters began to slow, then stop, then collapse inward on themselves. Impossible, breathed Ambassador Sisktal from her observation post. The energy requirements alone would drain the power reserves of a dozen star systems. Sir, Communications Officer Dralhai announced. Captain Chen is requesting that all observers maintain safe distance. She says the next part might be a bit dramatic. The human flagship, a blocky monstrosity that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, suddenly blazed with energy that registered across every spectrum their sensors could detect. The other 11 ships immediately altered course to form a perfect spherical formation around the densest concentration of Void Eaters. What happened next would be analyzed by Confederation scientists for decades without reaching a complete understanding. Reality hiccuped. The space containing the Void Eaters suddenly wasn't there anymore. Not empty space, not vacuum, not even the absence of matter. The region simply failed to exist, as if the universe had forgotten it was supposed to be there. Then it snapped back, and the Void Eaters were gone. Not destroyed, not dispersed, not driven away. Gone, as if they had never existed at all. The human ships regrouped in their previous formation and resumed course toward Proxima Station as if they had just completed a routine training exercise. Status report, Vexhai said automatically, his combat reflexes struggling to process what had just occurred. All hostile contacts have been eliminated, Tactical Coordinator Brixnell reported in a voice that suggested he didn't believe his own words. Proxima Station is secure. The human task force is requesting docking permission to assist with civilian evacuation. Vexhai opened a channel to the human flagship. Captain Chen, what did you just do? Oh, that? Came the cheerful reply. We convinced the universe that those things were a logical paradox and asked it to resolve the inconsistency. Turns out reality has very strict rules about things that shouldn't exist. The explanation made no sense whatsoever. Logical paradoxes were philosophical concepts, not tactical weapons. Reality didn't have rules that could be invoked like legal precedents. The universe was not a computer system that could be asked to debug itself. How is such a thing possible, he asked. Well, Captain Chen's voice carried the tone of someone explaining a simple mechanical process. We've learned that consciousness and reality interact in interesting ways. If enough minds agree that something is impossible, the universe tends to accommodate that perspective. We just had to convince a sufficiently large portion of local spacetime that entities existing outside physical law were, by definition, impossible. You convinced reality to change its mind? Vexhai asked, his translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in any known language. Not change, exactly. More like we reminded it of its own rules and pointed out an inconsistency. Reality really doesn't like inconsistencies. The war room had fallen completely silent, except for the background hum of life support systems and the quiet clicking of Vexhai's mandibles as his mind tried to process the implications. A species that could rewrite reality by filing complaints with the universe itself. Captain, he said carefully, how many humans are capable of this kind of reality adjustment? Oh, all of us, really. Some are better at it than others, but it's not particularly difficult once you understand the principles. We've been doing small-scale reality editing for decades. This was just the first time we tried it on something this size. Vexhai felt that strange new fear returning, stronger than before. The humans hadn't just solved an impossible military problem, they had solved it casually, as if convincing the universe to debug itself was a routine technical procedure. Are there any limitations to this ability? He asked. Mostly legal ones, Chen replied, and Vexhai could hear the smile in her voice. We've learned that reality has something like a legislative process. Major changes require consensus among all conscious observers in the affected area. Minor changes can be pushed through on a local basis, but they tend to get overturned if they're too disruptive. Legal limitations, Vexhai repeated slowly. You're saying that reality has a legal system? More like parliamentary procedure, really. It's quite fascinating once you learn to recognize the patterns. We're still working out all the rules, but it's definitely based on some kind of democratic process among conscious minds. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could influence reality through consensus, then a species with sufficient numbers and coordination could literally vote on the laws of physics. The humans had apparently discovered that the universe was not a fixed system, but a negotiable framework that could be modified through proper procedure. and they were treating it like an interesting hobby project. "Commander," Science Coordinator Thymal announced, "I'm detecting massive spatial distortions throughout the combat zone. The area where the Void Eaters were eliminated is showing signs of reality restructuring." "What kind of restructuring?" Vexay asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. "The local physics constants are stabilizing at new values. It's as if the universe is reinforcing the changes the humans made, making them permanent parts of natural law for this region of space." Captain Chen's voice crackled over the communication system. "Sorry about that. We probably should have mentioned that reality adjustments tend to be self-reinforcing. The good news is that this sector of space is now permanently immune to Void Eater incursions. The bad news is that faster-than-light travel through this region is going to be a bit more complicated for the next few decades while the new physics settle in." Vexhai closed his eyes, all four of them, and tried to imagine explaining this to the Confederation Council. A human task force had eliminated an existential threat to galactic civilization by filing a complaint with reality itself, and as a side effect had permanently altered the laws of physics for an entire star sector. The humans considered this a successful field test. "Captain Chen," he said finally, "on behalf of the Confederation, I want to thank you for your assistance in this crisis." "Happy to help, Commander. We learned a lot from this engagement. Next time, we think we can probably eliminate the hostile entities without the side effects. We're getting better at reading the fine print in universal law." Vexhai opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display showing the impossible aftermath of an impossible battle. The human ships were now docked at Proxima Station, their crews assisting with evacuation procedures and repairs, with the same casual competence they had just demonstrated while editing reality. For the first time in his military career, Commander Vexhai truly understood what it meant to be afraid of an ally. The Confederation Council chambers had never hosted a session quite like this one. Representatives from 47 species sat in their respective environmental zones, each one struggling to process the reports from the Void Eater incident. The humans had been invited to present their formal account of the engagement, and Captain Chen stood at the central podium with the same relaxed confidence she had displayed during their first contact 3 months ago. "The technical details are all in the submitted documentation," she was saying, gesturing toward a holographic display that showed equations most of the assembled beings couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. "The short version is that we've learned consciousness and reality interact through what we're calling consensus mechanics. When enough minds agree that something should work a certain way, the universe accommodates that consensus." Council Speaker Thexnari, a being whose species had been ancient when most of the galaxy was still stellar dust, leaned forward in his null-gravity suspension field. "Captain Chen, you are describing the fundamental nature of existence as if it were a political process." "That's exactly what it is," Chen replied cheerfully. "Reality is democratic. It's just that most species never realized they had voting rights." The statement sent ripples of unease through the assembled representatives. If the humans were correct, then the basic assumptions underlying galactic civilization were fundamentally flawed. Every species had developed technology and culture based on the belief that natural laws were immutable. The idea that physics could be changed through conscious consensus was revolutionary to the point of being incomprehensible. "You are claiming," said Ambassador Vorthak of the crystalline hegemony, her mineral form resonating with skeptical harmonics, "that your species has discovered how to alter the laws of physics through collective belief." "Not belief exactly," Captain Chen corrected. "Understanding. The universe has rules, but those rules are more like guidelines that can be modified through proper procedure. You have to understand what you're asking for and why it should be allowed. Random belief doesn't work. Educated consensus does." Commander Vexhai activated his speaking array from his position in the military observation gallery. "Captain, during the engagement with the Void Eaters, your task force operated with precision that suggests extensive prior experience. How long has your species been capable of reality adjustment?" Chen's expression became thoughtful. The first time Vexhai had seen her display anything approaching uncertainty.
"That's actually a complicated question, Commander."
"We've been doing small-scale reality adjustment for most of our recorded history. We just called it different things. Art, music, literature, scientific breakthroughs, medical miracles. Whenever humans collectively decided something was possible, it usually became possible." She gestured toward the holographic display, which shifted to show images from human history. "Our early space program was a reality adjustment project. The mathematics said it should have been impossible to reach orbit with chemical rockets, but we collectively decided it could be done anyway. Our faster-than-light drive works because enough humans agreed that the speed of light was more of a suggestion than a law." The images continued cycling, showing human achievements that defied conventional understanding. Art that moved observers to tears, Music that could heal psychological trauma. Stories that changed the fundamental beliefs of entire civilizations. You're saying your species has been unconsciously manipulating reality for thousands of years? Asked science coordinator Thymel from her aquatic environment. Unconsciously and consciously, Chen confirmed. The difference is that now we understand the mechanism. We can work with reality intentionally instead of accidentally. Council Speaker Texnari's ancient voice carried harmonics of deep concern. Captain Chen, if what you describe is accurate, why has no other species discovered these consensus mechanics? For the first time since the session began, Captain Chen's smile faltered slightly. That's the part that makes us a bit nervous, she admitted. Most species seem to develop strict mental frameworks about what's possible and what isn't. You create categories like natural law and scientific fact that become mental barriers to consensus formation. Humans are unusual in that we've never really accepted limitations as permanent. The implications of this statement struck the assembled representatives like a kinetic bombardment. Species that had spent millions of years carefully categorizing and understanding the universe had inadvertently trapped themselves within those categories. The humans, with their chaotic and often contradictory approach to knowledge, had remained mentally flexible enough to negotiate with reality itself.
Are you saying, Ambassador Sisktal asked through her translator, that our scientific advancement has actually limited our ability to interact with the fundamental nature of existence?
Not limited exactly, Chen replied diplomatically. More like specialized.
You've become very good at working within established parameters. We've become good at questioning whether those parameters are actually required. Vexhay felt his combat assessment system struggling to process the tactical implications. If consciousness could alter reality, then every assumption about military strategy, technological development, and civilizational advancement was potentially incorrect. The humans weren't just more advanced than the Confederation species. They were operating from an entirely different understanding of how the universe functioned. Captain, he said, what are the limits of human reality adjustment capabilities? Chen's smile returned, and Vexhay immediately regretted asking the question. We're still figuring that out, Commander. So far, we haven't found any hard limits, just procedural complications. Bigger changes require more consensus, and some changes have unintended consequences that need to be managed carefully. She gestured toward the holographic display, which began showing what appeared to be blueprints for impossible structures. For example, we've been working on a project to eliminate entropy on a galactic scale. The preliminary consensus suggests it's technically feasible, but the administrative overhead is substantial. We'd need buy-in from every conscious mind in the affected region. You want to eliminate entropy, repeated Council Speaker Texnari in a voice that suggested he was questioning his own translation systems. The fundamental thermodynamic force that drives the expansion and heat death of the universe.
Want is a strong word, Chen replied.
We're exploring whether it's possible. Turns out the universe doesn't actually require entropy to function properly. It's more of a default setting that could be changed if enough minds agreed it should be changed. The council chamber erupted in a cacophony of translation static as 47 species attempted to process the concept simultaneously. The humans were casually discussing the elimination of one of the fundamental forces of reality as if it were a municipal infrastructure project. Why? Asked Ambassador Vorthak, her crystalline form flickering with patterns that suggested cognitive overload. Why would you want to change something so fundamental? Because it's interesting, Chen replied with the same tone she might use to explain why someone would choose one flavor of food over another. We're curious about what a universe without entropy would look like. Would time still flow the same way? Would consciousness develop differently? Would entirely new forms of life become possible? Vexahai's strategic analysis systems were now operating in emergency mode, trying to calculate threat assessments for a species that considered rewriting the fundamental laws of physics to be an interesting experiment. Every calculation returned the same result. Unknown variables exceeded computational capacity. Captain Chen, he said carefully, has your species considered the possibility that such experiments might have consequences beyond your ability to predict or control? The human's expression became serious. And for a moment, Vexhai saw something in her eyes that looked almost like the fear he was learning to understand. Then it was gone, replaced by that unsettling confidence that seemed to be the default human emotional state. Of course we have, Commander. That's why we're being careful about it. We're not going to change universal constants without understanding what might happen. We're running smaller-scale tests first. Smaller-scale tests, Vexhai repeated. of entropy elimination. Just local reversals in controlled environments, Chen explained as if this were the most reasonable thing in the galaxy. We've successfully reversed entropy in regions up to about 12 cubic kilometers for periods of up to 6 months. No significant side effects detected so far. Science coordinator Thimel's aquatic form was now churning with agitation patterns that suggested either extreme excitement or complete terror. Captain, the energy requirements for such an operation should be astronomically beyond any conceivable power source. That's the beautiful part, Chen replied, her enthusiasm returning. Consensus mechanics don't require energy in the traditional sense. Reality adjustment is powered by agreement, not by conversion of matter to energy. When enough minds collectively understand and accept a change, the universe implements it automatically. The council chamber had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by the ambient sounds of life support systems, and the quiet clicking of Vexai's mandibles as his mind tried to process the implications. Captain, Council Speaker Texnari said slowly, "What does your species want from the Galactic Confederation?" It was the question everyone had been avoiding, the fundamental issue that made this entire discussion so terrifying. Here was a species with apparently godlike power over the basic functions of reality. What did beings like that want from civilizations that were still limited by conventional physics? Chen's answer was immediate and delivered with that characteristic smile that Vexai was beginning to understand was not entirely reassuring. "We want to share." "Share," repeated Ambassador Sisktal, her translator struggling with the concept. "We want to teach consensus mechanics to anyone who's interested in learning," Chen explained. "Reality adjustment is much more effective when more minds are involved. A galaxy where every species understands how to work with universal law would be much more interesting than one where only humans can do it." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. The humans wanted to teach reality-altering capabilities to every species in the galaxy. They wanted to democratize the ability to rewrite the laws of physics. "Why?" whispered Ambassador Vorthak. "With your capabilities, you could rule the entire galaxy. Why share power that could make you gods?" Captain Chen looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Why would we want to rule anything? Ruling is boring. We're much more interested in seeing what happens when everyone gets to play with the universe's source code. She gestured toward the assembled representatives with an expression of genuine enthusiasm. Imagine what 47 species working together could accomplish. Imagine the questions we could ask, the problems we could solve, the entirely new forms of existence we could discover. The universe is vast and full of possibilities we haven't even thought of yet. Vexai felt that strange fear crystallizing into something approaching terror. The humans weren't offering alliance or partnership, they were offering transcendence, the opportunity to become something fundamentally beyond what any species had ever imagined possible. And they thought it would be fun. "The learning process," he said carefully. "How complex is it?" Chen's smile widened. "That depends on how willing you are to let go of your assumptions about what's possible. Some humans pick it up in a few days. Others take years to overcome their mental conditioning. But everyone can learn it eventually." She paused, then added with that casual tone that made Vex's combat instincts scream warnings. "We've prepared some introductory materials for anyone who's interested. Fair warning, though, once you understand consensus mechanics, you can't really go back to thinking of reality as fixed. It tends to change your perspective on everything." Council Speaker Thexnari's ancient voice carried harmonics of profound uncertainty. "Captain Chen, what you are offering, it would fundamentally alter the nature of galactic civilization."
Yes, Chen agreed cheerfully.
"We think that would be a good thing. Current galactic civilization is interesting, but it could be so much more." Vexai looked around the council chamber at representatives from species that had considered themselves the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement. All of them were staring at a human who was casually offering to teach them how to become gods, and she genuinely believed they would enjoy the experience. 6 weeks after the Confederation Council session, Commander Vexai stood in his private quarters aboard the Eternal Vigilance, staring at a small crystalline data storage device that contained what humans called Consensus Mechanics, a beginner's guide. He had requested the materials 3 days ago. They had been sitting on his desk ever since, untouched. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in military strategy and tactical analysis, recognized the device for what it was, the most dangerous weapon in galactic history. Knowledge that could fundamentally alter reality itself, packaged in a format simple enough for a beginner to understand. The other part of his mind, the part that had been growing stronger since his first encounter with Captain Chen, whispered that he was afraid. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication. HFY activated his personal array to find Captain Chen's image materializing in his quarters via holographic projection. "Commander," she said with that familiar smile, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to check in and see how you were doing with the introductory materials." "I haven't begun studying them yet," HFY admitted, his mandibles clicking with involuntary stress patterns. Chen's expression became more serious, though the underlying confidence never wavered. "May I ask why not? If you're having second thoughts about learning consensus mechanics, that's completely understandable. It's a big step." HFY's four eyes focused on the data storage device, then back to Chen's holographic image. "Captain, in my species' military traditions, there is a concept called the weapon of absolute victory. A theoretical armament so powerful that its mere existence changes the fundamental nature of conflict itself." "Interesting concept," Chen replied. "I'm guessing that's not necessarily considered a good thing in military philosophy." "No," HFY confirmed. "The weapon of absolute victory eliminates the possibility of honorable combat, strategic challenge, or meaningful victory. It reduces all conflicts to a simple question of who possesses the ultimate tool. Our philosophers concluded that such a weapon would effectively end warfare by making it pointless." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And you see consensus mechanics as that kind of weapon?" "I see consensus mechanics as something far more dangerous," HFY said quietly. "A weapon can only destroy. What you're offering has the potential to make destruction itself meaningless. If death is reversible, if physical laws are negotiable, if reality itself can be edited, what remains?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time since he had known her, Captain Chen took a long moment to consider her response. "That's actually a profound question, Commander," she said finally. "When we first discovered consensus mechanics, a lot of humans had similar concerns. We had philosophers who argued that unlimited power over reality would eliminate meaning, purpose, and growth." She gestured, and additional holographic displays appeared showing what looked like documentation from human philosophical and scientific institutions. "We spent about 50 years debating the implications before we reached a consensus of our own." "What conclusion did you reach?" HFY asked, though part of him suspected the answer would be typically human in its disregard for conventional wisdom. "We decided that meaning isn't derived from limitations," Chen replied. "It's derived from choices. The ability to change reality doesn't eliminate the need to choose what reality should become. If anything, it makes those choices more important." The holographic displays shifted to show what appeared to be vast collaborative projects involving thousands of human minds working together. Cities that existed in 11 dimensions, artworks that could only be perceived by consciousness itself, scientific experiments that used entire galaxies as laboratory equipment. "When you can do anything," Chen continued, "the question becomes what you should do. That's actually much more challenging than working within fixed limitations." HFY studied the images, trying to comprehend the scale of human ambition. "And this doesn't concern you?" "The possibility that unlimited power might lead to unlimited consequences." "Of course it concerns us," Chen admitted. "That's why we're being careful about it. That's why we want to share consensus mechanics with other species instead of keeping it to ourselves." The logic took HFY a moment to follow. "You're distributing this ability because you're concerned about the consequences of possessing it alone?" "Exactly," Chen said, and her smile returned with an edge of something that might have been relief. "Power concentrated in the hands of a single group, even a benevolent group, is dangerous by definition. But power shared among many diverse perspectives tends to be self-correcting." She gestured toward another set of displays showing complex mathematical models. "When humans work together on reality adjustment projects, we automatically check each other's assumptions and motivations. Different viewpoints lead to better outcomes. We think the same principle would apply on a galactic scale. You want other species to learn consensus mechanics because you believe diversity of thought will prevent abuse of the ability," HFY summarized. "Partly that, and partly because we're genuinely curious about what non-human minds might discover," Chen replied. "Human consciousness has certain tendencies. We're innovative but often chaotic, creative but sometimes destructive. Other species might find entirely different approaches to working with reality." HFY felt his combat assessment system struggling with a new type of strategic calculation. The humans weren't just offering power, they were offering responsibility. The ability to alter reality came with the obligation to use that ability wisely.
and they believed that obligation was best shared among as many different perspectives as possible. "Captain," he said slowly, "what happens if a species learns consensus mechanics but uses them for destructive purposes?" Chen's expression became grave, and for the first time Vexhai saw something in her eyes that looked like genuine worry.
That's the scenario that keeps us awake at night, Commander.
Consensus mechanics amplify consciousness, including destructive consciousness. A species dedicated to elimination or domination could potentially cause unimaginable damage. And yet you're still offering to teach these abilities to anyone who wants to learn them, Vexhai observed.
"Because the alternative is worse," Chen replied immediately. "A galaxy where only humans understand consensus mechanics is a galaxy where humanity eventually becomes corrupted by that exclusive power."
History teaches us that absolute power corrupts absolutely, even when it's held by beings with good intentions. The holographic displays shifted again, showing what appeared to be decision trees and probability matrices.
"We've run the calculations thousands of times using different assumptions and parameters. Every scenario where power remains concentrated leads to eventual corruption and abuse. Every scenario where power is widely distributed leads to eventual stability and growth."
Vexhai's strategic mind began processing the implications.
"So you're gambling the safety of the entire galaxy on the theory that distributing reality-altering abilities will lead to better outcomes than restricting them." "Not gambling," Chen corrected.
"Making an informed decision based on the best available data and our understanding of how consciousness and power interact over time." She paused, then added with characteristic human directness, "Besides, the cat's already out of the bag, as we say. Humans know about consensus mechanics, which means other species will eventually discover them too.
We can either teach these abilities responsibly or wait for someone else to figure them out on their own, possibly with less benevolent intentions." The logic was sound, Vexhai had to admit. If consensus mechanics were discoverable, then multiple species would eventually develop them independently. Better to have guided development with ethical considerations than uncontrolled development with unknown motivations.
"Commander," Chen said gently, "may I ask what specifically concerns you about learning consensus mechanics yourself?" Vexhai's mandibles clicked as he considered the question. "I am a warrior, Captain. My entire identity, my species' entire culture, is built around concepts of strength, strategy, and honorable combat. If reality becomes negotiable, what purpose do warriors serve?" "Have you considered," Chen asked, "that warriors might be exactly what the galaxy needs most right now?"
The question caught him off guard.
"Explain." "Learning to alter reality responsibly requires discipline, strategic thinking, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure," Chen said. "Those are warrior qualities, Commander. The galaxy doesn't need fewer warriors. It needs warriors who understand their new battlefield." The holographic displays shifted to show what appeared to be training exercises involving humans learning consensus mechanics. Vexhai was surprised to see that many of the participants appeared to be military personnel, their exercises focusing on precision, control, and careful application of reality-altering techniques. "Consensus mechanics isn't about eliminating conflict," Chen explained. "It's about changing the nature of conflict. Instead of fighting over resources or territory, conscious beings will be debating questions of how reality should function, what values should guide universal law, and what forms of existence should be possible." "Philosophical warfare," Vexhai murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. "Philosophical warfare with the highest possible stakes," Chen confirmed. "When the weapons are ideas that can reshape reality itself, the quality of strategic thinking becomes paramount. Warriors don't become obsolete, they become more important than ever." Vexhai looked again at the crystalline storage device containing the introductory materials. "And if I learn these abilities, what happens to my identity as a Kalthari warrior?" "That's up to you," Chen replied. "Consensus mechanics amplify what you already are, Commander. They don't replace it. You would still be a warrior. You would just be a warrior with an expanded understanding of what battles are worth fighting and what victories are worth winning." The communication continued for another hour, with Chen answering questions about training procedures, safety protocols, and the philosophical implications of reality adjustment. Throughout the conversation, Vexhai found himself impressed not just by her knowledge, but by her obvious concern for the ethical implications of what humans were offering. When the communication ended, he sat alone in his quarters, staring at the storage device that contained the key to transcending every limitation his species had ever accepted as natural law. For the first time in his military career,
Commander Vexhai faced a battle where victory and defeat were equally terrifying. He activated the device. The first lesson was deceptively simple. Reality is a collaborative fiction maintained by the collective agreement of all conscious minds. To change reality, you must first understand what you are asking reality to become, and why that change serves the greater good of all conscious beings. As he began to study, Vexhai felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of existence itself. The fear was still there, stronger than ever. But alongside it was something else, something he had never experienced in all his battles across the stars. For the first time in his life, Commander Vexhai was afraid of what he might become capable of. And despite that fear, he continued reading. 8 months after first contact, the Hegemony War reached its final phase. Commander Vexhai stood on the command deck of the Joint Human Confederation Fleet flagship, watching tactical displays that showed the last desperate assault of his own species against the combined forces of galactic civilization. The irony was not lost on him. 3 days ago, he had been a loyal officer of the Kalthari Third Hegemony. Today, he was leading the defense against them. The change had not been his choice. Enemy fleet composition confirms our intelligence reports, announced Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the human tactical coordinator who had become Vexhai's closest collaborator. 87 dreadnoughts, 300 escort vessels, and approximately 15 million ground assault troops distributed across carrier ships. Estimated time to engagement, Vexhai asked, his 4 hands moving across control surfaces that now felt alien despite a lifetime of training. 17 minutes at current approach vectors, Martinez replied. Commander, are you sure about this? Once we begin, there's no going back. Vexhai's compound eyes focused on the tactical displays showing the approaching Kalthari fleet. Each ship represented thousands of warriors he had once served beside, beings who considered him a traitor for choosing to stand with the humans and their impossible gifts. I am certain, he said, though the words carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of torn loyalties. The crisis had begun 2 weeks ago, when the Kalthari High Command declared humanity a corruption that threatened the natural order of the galaxy. Intelligence reports suggested that several other species were secretly supporting the hegemony's position, viewing human reality adjustment capabilities as an existential threat to established civilization. From the Kalthari perspective, the argument was sound. If consciousness could alter reality, then every assumption about natural law, divine will, and cosmic order was meaningless. Better to eliminate the source of such chaos before it could spread. What they hadn't anticipated was that humans had already begun training volunteers from other species in basic consensus mechanics. Vexhai was one of the first non-humans to successfully alter reality through conscious consensus. The experience had been simultaneously enlightening and terrifying, like discovering that everything he thought he knew about existence was merely the opening paragraph of a vast story. Commander, Martinez said gently, the Kalthari fleet is broadcasting surrender demands on all frequencies. They're demanding that you return to face military tribunal for treason against your species. Treason? Vexhai repeated, his mandibles clicking with bitter amusement. They believe I have betrayed them by learning that reality is negotiable. Have you? Asked Captain Chen, her voice carrying no judgment despite the weight of the question. The question had been haunting Vexhai since the moment he successfully performed his first reality adjustment 3 weeks ago. In learning consensus mechanics, had he betrayed his species' fundamental beliefs about the nature of existence? Or had he transcended limitations that had been holding them back? I have betrayed nothing, he said finally. I have simply learned to see truth that was always present. The approaching Kalthari fleet represented the largest military force his species had ever assembled. Traditional combat doctrine suggested the Joint Human Confederation fleet would be outnumbered and outgunned, facing inevitable defeat against superior numbers and firepower. Traditional combat doctrine no longer applied. All consensus-trained personnel to reality adjustment stations, Martinez announced over the fleet communication system. Prepare for coordinated consciousness intervention. Across the fleet, beings from 17 different species took positions at stations that looked like meditation chambers crossed with high-energy physics laboratories. Humans worked alongside Confederation volunteers who had learned the basics of consensus mechanics in intensive training programs that compressed millions of years of philosophical development into months of practical application. Vexhai activated his personal reality adjustment interface, feeling the familiar sensation of his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his physical form. Around him, dozens of other minds joined the growing network of awareness that would collectively determine the outcome of the coming engagement. Contact established with local reality substrate. announced Dr. James Walsh, the human consciousness specialist who coordinated large-scale consensus operations. All participants confirmed successful interface with universal law framework. Through the expanded awareness of the consensus network, Vex-High could perceive the approaching Kael'thari fleet not just as ships and weapons, but as concentrations of consciousness carrying specific beliefs about reality. His former comrades were absolutely convinced that the universe operated according to fixed laws that could not be changed. That conviction was their strength in conventional warfare, but it would become their weakness in this new type of conflict. Hegemony fleet has entered engagement range, Martinez reported. They're targeting our lead vessels with quantum disruptors.
Acknowledged, Dr. Burke.
Walsh replied. All consciousness participants prepare to implement Defensive Protocol 7. Remember, we're not trying to destroy their weapons. We're asking reality to reconsider whether those weapons should work the way the hegemony expects them to. The quantum disruptors fired weapons that should have torn through shield matrices and vaporized hull materials in seconds. Instead, the energy beams encountered local reality conditions that had been collectively adjusted to operate under slightly different physical laws. In the space around the joint fleet, the speed of light was negotiable. Energy conservation was treated as a guideline rather than a law, and quantum mechanics followed rules that prioritize consciousness over probability. The hegemony weapons fired, and nothing happened. What? Came the confused broadcast from the Kael'thari fleet commander. All weapons report successful firing solutions, but no impact signatures detected. Hegemony fleet is increasing power settings and attempting multiple firing patterns, Martinez observed. No effect on joint fleet vessels. Through the consensus network, Vex-High felt the collective bewilderment of the Kael'thari forces as their absolute certainty about physical law encountered the impossible. Their weapons worked perfectly according to the universe they understood. But they were now operating in a region of space where that universe was only one of many possible options. Commander, Dr. Walsh said through the network interface, we've successfully neutralized their offensive capabilities without causing any casualties. Do you want to begin Phase 2? Phase 2 involved convincing the Kael'thari fleet that their ship's engines operated according to different principles than they expected. Instead of propelling them forward, the engines would generate what humans called educational momentum, carrying the ships toward understanding rather than conquest. Implement Phase 2, Vex-High confirmed, though the decision felt like crossing a line from which there could be no return. The consensus network focused its collective attention on the concept of transportation and movement. Across the joint fleet, beings from 17 species agreed that in this particular region of space, starship engines should carry their crews toward wisdom rather than warfare. The effect was immediate and impossible. The Kael'thari fleet continued approaching, their engines functioning normally according to every instrument reading they possessed. But instead of closing distance for combat engagement, they found themselves arriving at a different destination entirely. Hegemony fleet is reporting massive navigation anomalies, Martinez announced, her voice carrying the tone of someone who still couldn't quite believe what she was witnessing, despite months of experience with consensus mechanics. Their engines are functioning normally, but they're somehow traveling towards the Meditation Nebula instead of our position. The Meditation Nebula was a region of space where ambient radiation created natural consciousness expanding effects. Ships that spent time there often reported profound philosophical insights among their crews. How is this possible? Came another broadcast from the Kael'thari commander. We are following direct approach vectors to your position, but our navigation systems indicate we are traveling in the opposite direction. Captain Chen activated the response channel. Commander Ketval, this is Captain Chen of the Joint Fleet. Your engines are working exactly as designed. We've simply convinced local spacetime that your ships should travel toward understanding instead of conflict. The silence that followed this statement lasted for nearly a minute. You are claiming to have altered the fundamental nature of space travel itself? Ketval finally responded. We're claiming to have negotiated a temporary adjustment to local physics for the duration of this engagement, Chen replied diplomatically. Your crews will find the journey educational. Through the consensus network, Vex-High felt the exact moment when the first Kael'thari warriors began to understand what had happened to them. Their absolute certainty about natural law cracked just slightly, allowing the first tiny doubt that reality might be more flexible than they had believed. That doubt was all the consensus network needed. Local reality conditions are becoming self-reinforcing, Dr. P. Walsh announced. The hegemony crews are beginning to question their assumptions about physical law. Their doubt is reducing the local consensus that supports conventional physics. What followed was unlike any military engagement in galactic history. As more Kalthari warriors began to understand that their fundamental beliefs about reality were limitations rather than truths, their ships began operating according to the new physical laws the Joint Fleet had implemented. Weapons designed for destruction found themselves generating art instead of explosions. Navigation systems began responding to emotional states rather than calculated coordinates. Life support systems started optimizing for philosophical insight rather than mere survival. "This is impossible," Ketvol broadcast, his voice carrying harmonics of wonder and terror. "These effects violate every principle of science and engineering." "Commander," Vexai responded, opening a direct channel to his former superior. "Science and engineering are tools for working with reality as it is. What if reality is not what we believed it to be?" The question resonated through the Kalthari fleet, transmitted not through communication systems but through the expanding awareness that consensus mechanics created among conscious minds. Warriors who had spent lifetimes believing in the absolute nature of physical law found themselves experiencing the universe as a collaborative creation that could be modified through understanding and agreement. "Vexay," Ketvol said, his voice now carrying personal pain rather than military authority. "What have you become?" Through the consensus network, Vexay felt the question strike to the heart of his own transformation. What had he become? Still a warrior, but one who fought with ideas instead of weapons. Still Kalthari, but one who understood that species' identity was a choice rather than a limitation. Still himself, but expanded beyond every boundary he had once accepted as natural law. "I have become what I always was," he replied, "a being capable of growth, change, and collaboration with others who seek truth rather than dominance." The Hegemony fleet had now traveled deep into the Meditation Nebula, their crews experiencing the reality-expanding effects of the ambient radiation, combined with their growing understanding of consensus mechanics. Ship after ship began broadcasting requests for information about human reality adjustment techniques. "Commander," Dr. Walsh announced through the network, "we're detecting the formation of multiple small consensus groups among the Hegemony crews. They're beginning to experiment with local reality modifications." What had begun as a military engagement was transforming into the largest educational event in galactic history. Beings who had arrived prepared for war were discovering abilities they had never imagined possessing. "Captain Chen," Ketvol broadcast, his voice now carrying harmonics of exhausted amazement, "the Kelthari High Command will consider this an act of war against our fundamental beliefs and culture." "Commander," Chen replied gently, "we haven't changed your beliefs or culture. We've simply shown your people that they have more options than they realized. What they choose to do with that knowledge is up to them." Through the consensus network, Vexay felt the truth of that statement resonating among the Kalthari crews. No one had been forced to learn reality adjustment. No one had been compelled to abandon their beliefs. They had simply been shown that the universe was vast enough to accommodate beliefs they had never imagined possible. "The High Command will send more fleets," Ketvol warned. "And we'll be here to welcome them," Captain Chen replied. "Learning is more effective when it's shared among friends." As the engagement concluded, Vexay found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with beings from across the galaxy, all of them united not by species or political allegiance, but by their shared commitment to understanding reality as it truly was, rather than as they had assumed it to be. For the first time since learning consensus mechanics, he understood that fear and wonder were not opposites but companions. The universe was vast beyond imagination, filled with possibilities that no single mind could comprehend alone. Standing shoulder to shoulder with humans had taught him that the most terrifying and exhilarating truth in existence was also the simplest. Anything was possible for minds willing to work together toward understanding. The Hegemony War ended not with victory or defeat, but with the realization that war itself was just another limitation that conscious beings could choose to transcend. Fear had finally found Commander Vexai, but it had brought wisdom as its gift.